Thank you so much. I would first like to say thank you to everyone out there who's ever prayed for me or who's ever prayed for my family. It's made all the difference in the world to me. As I've had the opportunity to go around and speak with different organizations and work with different people, I found out that we all have at least one thing in common. We all have problems. I don't know anybody who has a perfect life. And I found that we all have to make choices every single day. A lot of times we make them subconsciously, but we always have a choice on how we're going to react. We don't always have a choice on what happens to us or how other people's choices affect us, but we always have a choice on how we're going to react, to what we're faced with. I remember as I was a 14-year-old girl, I wasn't anything out of the ordinary. I was pretty shy. I was excited to finish junior high, excited to go to high school, and then my life changed in a way I could never imagine. I remember going to bed one night, just like I always did, and the next thing, I remember hearing a voice, a man's voice, a voice I didn't recognize. I remember the voice saying, "I have a knife at your neck. Don't make a sound. Get up and come with me." Now, up until that moment, I really didn't know what fear was. I didn't really know what being scared was. I mean, my biggest scare at that moment was, I don't know, failing my math test or my parents catching me watch TV when they told me not to. I mean, those were what my biggest scares were. So when this man was standing over me with a knife, I was petrified. I couldn't believe how had this happened. How had this happened to me? I mean, I was nobody. I remember him grabbing hold of my wrist and pulling me out of bed. I remember immediately jumping up and doing exactly as he said. I remember him leading me out through my house, up into the mountains behind my house. I remember along the way stopping him saying, "If you're just going to rape and kill me, would you please do it here?" Because I wanted my family to know what happened. I wanted them to know that I hadn't run away. I wasn't upset with them. I wasn't rebelling. I wanted them to know what had happened. I remember he stopped and he looked at me and he smiled and he said, "I'm not going to rape and kill you yet." And then we kept going. I remember we went a ways further and I stopped him again and I said, "Well, don't you realize what you're doing? If you get caught, you will spend the rest of your life in prison. Please let me go. If you let me go, my family won't press any charges." Well, he looked at me again and he smiled and he said, "I know exactly what I'm doing and I know what the consequences are. The only difference is I'm not going to get caught." I remember we went on so far, we crossed right over the top of the mountain and we started down the other side. We were probably only a quarter of the way down the other side when we walked into a grove of trees. And there I saw that part of the mountain had been leveled out and there was a tent set up. Outside of the tent there were tarps lying on the ground and tarps hanging in the trees. But the scariest sight of all about this entire camp, it wasn't the tent, it wasn't the tarps, it wasn't the dugout behind the tents. It was the woman that walked out of the tent. She came up to me, and the first thing she did was she hugged me. In this moment, you'd almost think that being hugged would be a comforting thing, would be something that would be nice to have. I mean, the scariest thing of my life had just happened to me. You would think a hug would be nice, but it wasn't. I mean, if hugs could speak, this hug would have said, "You're nothing. You're mine, and you'll do exactly what I tell you to do, because if you don't, I have no problem killing you." I remember she brought me inside the tent and sat me down on a bucket, where she forced me into robes, forced me to take off my pajamas, and then she left. And I remember the man walking back in, and he had changed out of his dark clothes into a robe, just like the one I'd been forced to put on. And he came over and he knelt down next to me. And then he started to speak. I was so scared and worried. How had this happened? Why was this happening? That I couldn't even begin to listen to what he was saying. But then somehow I caught the last sentence. Somehow I was able to pull myself together, and I heard him say, I hereby seal you to me as my wife before God and his angels as my witnesses. I don't know. Maybe I just grew up watching too many happily ever after Disney movies, but this was not how I envisioned getting married or my happily ever after. This was anything but that. I remember screaming out no, and he looked at me and he said, if you ever scream out like that again, I will kill you. I remember telling him I wouldn't scream out, but I started to beg and plead and do everything I could to hold him off. Didn't have to be forever, just long enough. Nothing worked, though. The more I tried, the more it just seemed to encourage him. I remember he finally grabbed hold of me and forced me onto the ground, where he ripped off the robe I had just been forced to put on, and then he raped me on the floor of the tent. Then he got up, and he looked down at me and smiled, turned around and walked out of the tent. I will never, ever forget how I felt lying on the ground. I felt so broken and so filthy. Who could ever love me? Who could ever want anything to do with me ever again? How could my family want me back? I ended up falling asleep, and when I woke up, there was this man kneeling over me, and he had a thick metal cable that he was wrapping around my ankle and bolting into place so I couldn't run away. I realized then that I wasn't going to be able to escape anytime soon. I realized that everything he had done because he planned on keeping me for a very long time. I started to think of all the other children's stories I'd seen on the news who had disappeared, how a search was put on, and eventually, maybe it was a week later, maybe it was months later, but eventually their body would be found. And the child would, well, they would always be dead. From the body, they'd be able to tell that this child had been abused, the child had been denied food, they'd just been tortured, raped, and ultimately killed. I thought that's what was going to happen to me. I mean, maybe just on a bigger, more long-term kind of scale. And as I sat there thinking about the children, I thought, wow, they're so lucky. They're so lucky they're dead right now, because nobody will be able to hurt them. Nobody will ever be able to make them feel bad or feel like they're worthless. I wish I could be one of them.